The year is 656. A house in Medina, modest, unguarded by soldiers, its wooden gate cracked from days of pounding fists. Inside, an old man sits alone with a copy of the Quran open across his lap. He is not a soldier. He is not hiding. He is the ruler of an empire that stretches from the shores of North Africa to the mountains of Persia, and he has just told his own household to put away their swords. Outside, hundreds of armed men are climbing the walls of his home. 4 weeks now, they have surrounded this house, cutting off his food, his water, his every attempt at peace. Some of the very companions who once fought beside him are begging him, right now on the other side of that door, to let them take up arms in his defense. He could call his guards. He could fight. He has fought before, for a prophet who once said no harm would ever come to him for what he'd given, for words spoken decades ago that this very moment seems to be testing. He does neither. He simply keeps reading. In a few minutes, blood will fall across the very page open in front of him, across a verse that seems to have been waiting for 20 years for this exact moment. How does the wealthiest man in Mecca, a man once so rich he could have bought his way out of any danger, end up alone, unarmed in a besieged house, refusing to save his own life? Let us begin. To understand how he got here, we have to go back decades before the siege. Before the Quran he was compiling had even been written down as one book. Back to a young man walking through the busy cloth markets of Mecca, already known, even then, for something rare. He gave things away. His name was Uthman ibn Affan ibn Abi al-As, born into the clan of Banu Umayyah, one of the most powerful and prosperous families in all of Mecca. Picture the city as he would have known it as a young man. Narrow stone streets baked hard under the desert sun. The Kaaba at its center, surrounded by hundreds of idols, incense smoke curling upward from pilgrims who came from every corner of Arabia. And weaving through it all, camel trains loaded with goods, the shouts of merchants haggling over bolts of cloth, the clink of silver changing hands. Mecca in those days was not a backwater. It was the financial heart of Arabia, a city built on the caravan trade, where fortunes were made moving cloth, leather and spices between Yemen and Syria. And within that world, Uthman was already, by his 20s, one of its most successful traders. He came from money, yes, but he did not simply inherit his fortune and sit back. Historians describe him personally leading caravans, negotiating deals, building his own reputation as a trader whose word could be trusted absolutely. In a marketplace where cheating a customer was often shrugged off as simply clever business, Uthman's honesty stood out enough that people remembered it, generation after generation, long after the transactions themselves were forgotten. He was known for his striking appearance, fair-skinned with a thick beard, a gentle voice, and an almost unshakable calm. Companions who knew him later in life would describe a man who rarely raised his voice, rarely lost his composure, and carried himself with a modesty that seemed almost out of place next to his wealth. But what set him apart from other wealthy Meccans wasn't his success. It was what he did with it. Long before he had ever heard the word Islam, Uthman had a reputation in Mecca for two things: honest dealing and quiet generosity. Merchants trusted him. The poor knew his door. When a family fell on hard times, when a debt threatened to ruin someone, Uthman's name would often surface, quietly without fanfare, a debt forgiven here, a gift given there. He was, by every account that survives him, a man already searching, in a society drowning in idol worship, for something more solid to stand on. Wealth had given him comfort. It had not given him certainty. And in a city where nearly everyone bowed to carved stone gods, Uthman is described by early biographers as a man who privately doubted the religion of his forefathers long before he ever heard the prophet speak. That search was about to be answered by an old friend. Uthman's closest friend was a man named Abu Bakr, a fellow merchant, older, deeply respected, and one of the very first people in Mecca to embrace the message of a man named Muhammad. News of this new message had been spreading quietly for some time. Muhammad, a man already known across Mecca for his honesty, so trusted that even his fiercest opponents once called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy one, had begun receiving revelation, and speaking of a single God, at a time when the entire city bowed to hundreds. Most of Quraysh's elite dismissed it outright, or worse. But Abu Bakr did not dismiss it. And when Abu Bakr believed something, the people who trusted him tended to listen closely. When Abu Bakr approached Uthman, he didn't need to argue for hours. He simply told him what he had seen and heard, that a prophet had risen among them, calling people back to the worship of one God, the God of Ibrahim. Uthman listened. Something in him recognized the truth of it almost instantly. Within days, he went to the Prophet Muhammad directly and accepted Islam, becoming one of the earliest converts in all of Mecca, among a small embattled circle of believers who had chosen faith over the approval of their entire society. He was among perhaps a dozen or so souls who had entered the fold of this new religion before it had any protection, any army, any promise of safety whatsoever. It was, by any measure, a dangerous decision. Uthman was giving up more than most. He had status. He had wealth. He had a family name that opened every door in the city. Other converts of Uthman's day, enslaved people, the poor, those without powerful clans to shield them, were tortured openly in the streets for their new faith. Uthman had more to lose, and Quraysh knew it. He was about to watch some of those doors slam shut. Not long after his conversion, something remarkable happened. The Prophet Muhammad gave his own daughter Ruqayya in marriage to Uthman. It was a bond that meant everything to him. But it came at a cost. As more of Quraysh's elite learned that Uthman, a son of Banu Umayyah, a man of wealth and standing, had joined this new and threatening faith, the persecution that had been aimed at poorer, less protected Muslims began to reach him too. His own uncle, according to the historians, is said to have had him bound and beaten for abandoning the religion of his forefathers. Yet Uthman did not recant. Not for a moment. He endured what came, and continued praying, continued believing, continued standing beside the small community of Muslims who had chosen the same difficult path. As the persecution of Muslims in Mecca grew unbearable, beatings, boycotts, starvation for entire families who refused to renounce their faith, some converts killed outright for their refusal to recant, the Prophet gave permission for a group of believers to flee. Not to safety in Arabia, where Quraysh's influence still reached. Somewhere further. Somewhere across the sea, beyond the political reach of Mecca's ruling elite entirely. Abyssinia. Uthman and Ruqayya were among the very first Muslims to make that journey, leaving behind wealth, comfort, and homeland, to live as refugees under a Christian king, for the sake of a faith barely a few years old. The Prophet is reported to have said of this journey, watching Uthman lead his wife toward the ships, that Uthman was following in the footsteps of the Prophet Lot, who had likewise emigrated for the sake of his Lord. It would not be the last sacrifice this couple made. Years later, after the believers had finally established a homeland in Medina, following the Hijrah, the migration that reshaped the entire course of Uthman's life and the life of the whole community, the young Muslim community faced its first true military test, the Battle of Badr. Every able-bodied believer wanted to stand in that line. It would become the most celebrated battle in early Islamic history, a small outnumbered force of roughly 300 facing down a far larger army from Mecca and, against every expectation, prevailing. Companions who fought at Badr would be spoken of with particular reverence for the rest of their lives, a mark of honor that every believer in Medina longed for. Uthman was not there. Ruqayya, his wife, the Prophet's own daughter, had fallen gravely ill, and the Prophet personally instructed Uthman to remain behind and nurse her, rather than march to battle. Imagine the weight of that moment. Every companion he knew, riding out to what could be the defining battle of their new faith, and Uthman staying back, torn between duty to his wife and the ache to stand beside his brothers. Ruqayya died during those very days of battle. And yet, when the Muslims returned victorious, the Prophet did something extraordinary. He counted Uthman as if he had been present at Badr, granting him a full share of the spoils, and a full share of its honor, a mark of trust so unusual it was granted to no one else absent that day. His grief for Ruqayya, though, was not so easily eased. Sometime after Ruqayya's death, the Prophet Muhammad made an offer that would give Uthman a title still used to describe him to this day. He gave Uthman his other daughter, Kulthum, in marriage. Two daughters of the Prophet, married in succession to the same man, a bond so rare in Islamic history that Uthman became known forever after as Dun Nurayn, the possessor of two lights. No other companion of the Prophet, before or after, would ever be given this same honor. It set Uthman apart in a way that had nothing to do with money at all, and everything to do with trust, the kind of trust a father places in a son-in-law he has watched up close for years. It's worth remembering that this second marriage came at a time of real grief. Uthman had lost Ruqayya while she lay sick, and he sat helplessly at her side. Whatever comfort came with being chosen again by the Prophet's own household, it did not erase that loss. It simply meant that even in mourning, Uthman remained bound as closely as any man could be to the family at the very center of this new faith. But titles were never what defined Uthman. What defined him, again and again, in ways his fellow believers never forgot, was what he did with what he had. And nowhere would that be clearer than in a dry well on the outskirts of Medina. Medina, in its early years, had a severe problem: fresh water. The city sat in a dry volcanic basin, and clean drinking water was scarce enough that it shaped daily life for everyone living there. Most of the wells belonged to individuals who charged steep prices for it, and one well in particular, known as Bir Ruma, was among the sweetest and most reliable sources of water in the entire region. It was privately owned by a man from the Jewish tribes of the area, who sold its water at a painful cost to the struggling Muslim community, families sometimes going without, simply because they couldn't afford what he charged. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, in front of his companions, a simple but electrifying promise: whoever purchased the well of Ruma and made its water free for all Muslims would be granted paradise. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. This wasn't a vague call for charity. It was a specific, named opportunity, a single well, a single transaction, and a promise of paradise attached directly to it. Every companion in that gathering heard the same words. Only one of them moved fast enough, and had the means, to actually claim it. Uthman went straight to the well's owner. The man, sensing the value of what he held, refused to sell the entire well, so Uthman negotiated something unusual. He would buy half of it, and the two men would take turns. One day the water would be his, free for the community. The next day it would belong to the original owner, sold at his price. The people of Medina simply waited for Uthman's day. They filled their vessels so completely on the day the water was free that, within a short time, the original owner realized he had nothing left to sell. Uthman bought the rest of the well outright, and made it free permanently for every soul in Medina. To this day, in the region of Medina, there is still a well known by that name, and by tradition, its waters are still given away, not sold, in memory of a promise made almost 1400 years ago. But Uthman's generosity was only getting started. Years later, the Prophet Muhammad prepared to lead the Muslims on their most difficult expedition yet, a march north toward Tabuk, through brutal heat, in the hardest season of the year, against the far larger and better equipped forces of the Byzantine Empire, the great superpower of the region at the time. The journey was so punishing: scorching daytime heat, scarce water along the route, crops back home left unharvested at exactly the wrong moment in the season, that the force assembled for it became known in history simply as Jaysh al-Usra, the Army of Hardship. Many companions who wanted desperately to join simply could not afford the mount, the weapons, or the provisions the journey demanded. Thousands of men needed to be fed, armed, and mounted for a campaign deep into hostile territory, and the young Muslim state's treasury could not begin to cover it. The Prophet stood before his companions and called for donations, and one by one, people gave what they could: a few coins here, a portion of dates there. The poorer companions, giving with visible sacrifice, moved to tears at times by how little they had to offer. Uthman did not give a portion. He gave almost everything asked of him and more. Historians record that he funded a significant share of the entire expedition. Camels by the hundreds. Horses. Gold. Enough that when he laid it all before the Prophet, poured out in front of the entire community, Muhammad is reported to have turned his hands over the gift again and again, saying, "Nothing will harm Uthman, whatever he does after this day." Think about what kind of statement that is. Not a thank you. Not a blessing for wealth to come. A declaration that Uthman's place, because of this single act, was secured beyond any future mistake he might ever make. It is a promise the young man sitting there that day could not have known he would need to hold on to, decades later, in a besieged house, with his own life on the line. Before we reach the moment that would define his standing among the companions forever, it's worth pausing on something quieter: the private habits of a man who, by every account, treated his faith as seriously behind closed doors as he did in public. Those who lived closest to Uthman describe a man of remarkable personal devotion. He is remembered as someone who would complete an entire recitation of the Quran in a single night of prayer, not occasionally, but as a regular practice, standing in the darkness of his own home long after everyone else in Medina had gone to sleep. He fasted often, far beyond what was required of him, and gave in charity so consistently that even his own household sometimes lost track of exactly how much passed through his hands toward those in need. There is a well-known account from this period of his life that captures something essential about how he was perceived, even by the Prophet himself. It's said that the Prophet Muhammad was once resting at home in a state of undress, as one might in the privacy of one's own house, when Abu Bakr asked to enter, and was granted entry without the Prophet changing his position. Then Umar asked to enter, and again, the Prophet remained as he was. Then Uthman asked to enter. The Prophet is reported to have sat up and adjusted his clothing before allowing him in. When asked afterward why he had shown this particular courtesy only for Uthman, the Prophet responded with words that have been repeated by Muslims for 14 centuries since: "Should I not feel shy of a man of whom even the angels are shy?" It's a small moment. No battle, no fortune, no grand gesture. But it tells you exactly how Uthman was seen by the people who knew him best. A man whose modesty ran so deep, so consistently, that it had become part of his very reputation, long before he ever wore the title of Caliph. There was one more moment before the Prophet's death, before Uthman ever wore the title of Caliph, that revealed exactly what kind of trust he had earned. In the 6th year after the Hijrah, the Prophet led over 1,000 believers toward Mecca, not for war, but for pilgrimage. They stopped at a place called Hudaybiyah, just outside the sacred city, and the Quraysh, wary and suspicious, refused to let them enter. Negotiations were needed, and the Prophet chose Uthman, a man with deep family connections still inside Mecca, to go in as his envoy. Uthman entered the city. Talks dragged on. And then days passed, with no word. A rumor spread through the Muslim camp like wildfire: Uthman had been killed. The Prophet's response to that rumor changed history. Rather than retreat, he gathered his companions beneath a tree and called for a pledge, a vow that if Uthman truly had been murdered, they would fight to the very last man in response. One by one, the companions placed their hands upon the Prophet's, swearing the oath. And when it came time for Uthman's own pledge, since he was not there to give it himself, the Prophet placed one hand over the other, and said the second hand belonged to Uthman. His own hand, standing in for a man believed dead. That moment became known as the Pledge of Ridwan, considered one of the most sacred vows in early Islamic history. And Uthman, as it turned out, was alive after all. He returned to camp not long after, to find that in his absence, the Prophet himself had vowed on his behalf. The Prophet Muhammad passed away in the year 632, leaving behind a grieving community and an uncertain future. Uthman, like every close companion, was devastated. The loss of the man who had shaped every part of his adult life was not something any of them were prepared for, no matter how much they had been warned it would one day come. But the young Muslim state could not afford to stand still in its mourning. Leadership fell first to Abu Bakr, and then, upon his death 2 years later, to Umar ibn al-Khattab. For a decade, under Umar's rule, the Muslim state expanded at a staggering pace, Persia and much of the Byzantine East falling under its reach. It was one of the most rapid territorial expansions in the ancient world, reshaping the map of the Middle East within a single generation. Uthman, throughout these years, remained one of Umar's closest and most trusted advisors, consulted on major decisions, respected for his judgment, and known still for living with striking simplicity despite commanding one of the largest personal fortunes in Medina. Then, in the year 644, tragedy struck the heart of the Muslim world. Umar was stabbed while leading the dawn prayer by an assassin's blade, a Persian slave acting, historians believe, out of personal grievance rather than political conspiracy. He lingered for several days before succumbing to his wounds. On his deathbed, Umar refused to simply name his own successor, unwilling to risk placing that weight on the community without wider counsel. Instead, he appointed a council of 6 of the most senior, most trusted companions of the Prophet, men who had witnessed the faith from its earliest days, and instructed them to choose the next leader of the Muslim world from among themselves, within 3 days. The deliberations were intense, carried out behind closed doors as the entire empire waited to learn who would lead it next. 2 names rose above the rest: Uthman and Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's own cousin and son-in-law, a man renowned for his courage and his closeness to the Prophet's own household. Both men were asked in turn the same question: whether they would govern according to the Quran, the practice of the Prophet, and the precedents set by the 2 caliphs before them. Both answered that they would strive to. In the end, the council chose Uthman. At around 70 years old, the wealthy merchant who had once given away wells and armies out of his own pocket now carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, an empire that stretched, by that point, from Egypt to the edges of Persia. You might expect that a man who now controlled the treasury of an entire empire would finally allow himself some comfort. Uthman did not. Accounts from those who observed him during his years as caliph describe a ruler who continued to dress plainly, who patched his own worn clothing rather than replace it, and who was known to personally distribute food and money to the poor and the traveling out of his own private wealth, separate entirely from the public treasury he now oversaw. He had, after all, been doing exactly this since long before anyone called him caliph. The position changed his responsibilities, but by every account, it did not change the man. There's a detail preserved by several early biographers that captures this well. Even as caliph, Uthman would sometimes be found personally feeding camels or handling matters of trade with his own hands, the instincts of the young merchant from Mecca never quite leaving him, even decades later, even with an empire's business resting on his schedule. He ruled, in other words, the same way he had always lived, without spectacle, without excess, treating the immense resources that passed through his hands as something to be stewarded and shared, rather than something to be enjoyed alone. It is precisely this reputation, decades deep, witnessed by thousands, impossible to fake, that made what came next so difficult for his community to reconcile. Uthman's caliphate would become known for one achievement above almost all others, an achievement that would shape the religious life of over 1 billion people who came after him. As the Muslim empire expanded rapidly across new lands and cultures, a serious problem emerged. Different regions were beginning to recite the Quran with slightly different dialectal variations, passed down through different companions' oral traditions. Reports reached Uthman of Muslim soldiers, from different provinces, arguing bitterly with one another over whose recitation was correct. Uthman understood the danger immediately. Left unresolved, this could fracture the very unity of the faith, a scripture recited differently in different corners of the empire, until eventually, generations down the line, those differences might harden into entirely separate traditions, the way other religious communities before them had split over sacred text. He was not willing to let that happen on his watch. He assembled a committee of the most trusted scholars and reciters in Medina, including Zayd ibn Thabit, who had once served as the Prophet's own scribe and had already helped compile a written copy of the Quran during Abu Bakr's caliphate, and set them to work compiling a single, standardized, authoritative written text of the Quran, cross-checked meticulously against the memories of the companions who had heard it directly from the Prophet's own recitation, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. It was painstaking, deliberate work. Every verse had to be verified, every variant reading examined and weighed. Nothing was left to a single person's memory alone. The committee cross-referenced multiple companions' recollections against one another before anything was considered settled. Once complete, Uthman ordered copies of this master text sent to every major province of the Muslim world, Kufa, Basra, Damascus, and beyond, with instructions that all other partial or variant written collections be set aside in favor of this single, unified version. It is, to this day, essentially the same text recited by Muslims across the globe. For this single act, Uthman is remembered by an entire faith as the one who preserved its central scripture from fragmentation, a legacy far outlasting any empire, any war, any single human lifetime. But an empire this size does not run on scripture alone, and the pressures of governing it were about to catch up with him. Under Uthman, the Muslim states' borders pushed further than they ever had before, deep into North Africa, into Cyprus by way of a newly built Muslim navy, into the far reaches of Persia and Armenia. It was Uthman who first authorized the construction of a Muslim fleet, recognizing that a state now bordering the Mediterranean could not remain a purely land power forever. That decision would prove decisive. The new navy secured Cyprus and gave the Muslim world its first real foothold on the sea, a capability that would shape the balance of power in the region for centuries to come. This was, by any historical measure, an era of extraordinary success. New wealth flowed into Medina. New peoples entered the fold of the Muslim world, from Berber communities in North Africa to Persian nobility in the East. Uthman, now in his 70s and 80s, an age at which most rulers before or since would have long retired from active governance, presided over the single largest territorial expansion the young state had yet seen, personally overseeing appointments, correspondence, and strategy for an empire that now touched 3 continents. But success this rapid rarely arrives without strain. New provinces meant new governors were needed, and Uthman, navigating a sprawling empire with the tools available to him, often turned to men from his own extended family, the Banu Umayyah, to fill many of these posts. To some, this looked like sound governance, placing capable, trusted administrators in difficult roles. To others, especially in the more distant provinces, it began to look like something else entirely. Favoritism. Nepotism. The empire's wealth, they whispered, was being kept within one family's hands. The seeds of a storm were being planted, and Uthman, an old man by now, gentle-natured and famously reluctant toward confrontation, would prove unwilling to meet that storm with force. The complaints grew louder. Some were legitimate grievances from provincial leaders who felt sidelined, or from soldiers unhappy with how newly conquered wealth was being distributed. Some, historians note, were stirred and amplified by agitators moving quietly between provinces, spreading exaggerated and sometimes outright false accusations against the aging caliph, men seeking to sow chaos rather than resolve genuine disputes. Later Muslim historians would point to one figure in particular, a shadowy agitator said to have traveled from province to province stoking division, though the full extent of his role remains debated among scholars to this day. Uthman, true to the character he had shown his entire life, responded not with crackdowns, but with patience. He met with delegations personally, sitting with men who had traveled hundreds of miles specifically to confront him. He answered accusations directly, one by one, in front of witnesses. When specific governors were shown to have genuinely wronged their people, he removed them without hesitation. He was not a man clinging blindly to his own appointments. But patience, in the eyes of his critics, began to look like weakness. And weakness, to men already inclined toward rebellion, looked like opportunity. Some of the companions closest to Uthman, men who had fought alongside the Prophet himself, urged him repeatedly to take a harder line, to move decisively against the agitators before matters spiraled further. Uthman, now well into his 80s, resisted. He had spent his entire life avoiding unnecessary conflict, giving rather than taking, softening tension rather than sharpening it, and he saw no reason his final years should suddenly demand a different kind of man than the one he had always been. It was not in his nature to suddenly become a different kind of ruler in his final years, even as the danger around him grew undeniable, even as those closest to him warned again and again, that patience alone would not be enough to hold back what was coming. By the year 656, groups of armed dissenters from Egypt, Kufa and Basra, several hundred strong, by some accounts closer to 1,000, began making their way toward Medina itself, arriving under the guise of pilgrims and petitioners. Officially, they claimed they wanted only to present grievances and seek redress. What they actually intended was something far more dangerous. The rebels arrived at Medina and set up camp on its outskirts, their numbers swelling as sympathizers from within the city joined them. For weeks, tension built in the streets of a city that had once been the peaceful heart of the entire Muslim world. Negotiations were attempted, mediated by respected companions trusted by both sides. At one point, it seemed a resolution had been reached. Uthman agreed to specific reforms, the delegations departed satisfied, and Medina exhaled, believing the crisis had passed. Then, according to the historical accounts, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. A letter was intercepted on the road, carried by a messenger heading toward Egypt, allegedly sent under Uthman's own seal, ordering harsh punishment against the very delegation that had just left in peace, the moment they arrived home. Uthman denied writing it, denied any knowledge of it, denied ordering the messenger, denied the contents, denied everything about it under direct questioning. Many historians believe the letter was a forgery, planted deliberately, likely by someone determined to reignite the very conflict that had just been so carefully diffused, whether to settle old scores or simply to plunge the state into chaos. Whatever its true origin, it worked exactly as intended. The rebels, furious and feeling betrayed, turned back toward Medina, this time, not to negotiate, to lay siege. They surrounded Uthman's house. And this is the moment where we return to where we began. This is it. The moment we glimpsed at the very start of this story, the old man alone, with his Quran open across his lap, while hundreds of armed men gather outside his walls. Now you know how he got here. For weeks, the siege dragged on. Uthman's own household, his family, a handful of loyal companions, begged him to let them defend the house by force. Several of the Prophet's own companions, including his kinsman al-Hassan, the son of Ali, and others such as Ibn Umar and Ibn al-Zubair, positioned themselves at the gate, ready to fight to protect him. These were not weak or reluctant men. They were seasoned fighters, some of the very best warriors the early Muslim community had produced, and they were begging for permission to act. Uthman forbade it. He ordered every one of them to lay down their weapons, and sent them away from the house entirely, rather than risk them dying on his account. He would not allow a single drop of Muslim blood to be spilled defending him. Not even his own defense was worth, in his eyes, the wound it would tear into the unity of the faith he had spent his whole life serving. Better, he reasoned, that only his own blood be spilled, than that Muslims kill each other over him. He was offered more than once the chance to simply step down from the caliphate, to end the siege peacefully by resigning his position. It would have been the easiest solution imaginable. Say a few words, hand over authority, and the armed men outside his gate would very likely have gone home satisfied. He refused that too. He is reported to have said that he would not remove a garment that Allah himself had clothed him in, that the responsibility placed on him was not his to discard simply to save his own life. He had, according to several accounts, seen a vision of the Prophet in the days before, and understood what awaited him, and had made his peace with it already. A peace that those around him, still desperate to save him, could not yet share. Water and food were eventually cut off from the house entirely. Even a request from Uthman simply for drinking water was denied by the men surrounding his home. For days, the man ruling one of the largest empires on earth, an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the mountains of Central Asia, sat inside his own home, besieged, thirsty, and unarmed, surrounded not by an invading army, but by men who called themselves believers in the very faith he had helped compile into scripture. Some companions elsewhere in Medina attempted to send water and supplies over the walls under cover of darkness. It was not enough to break the siege, only enough to keep an old man alive a little longer, for what was coming. On the day the siege reached its end, the attackers found a way over the back walls of the house, a route the main defenders hadn't anticipated, slipping in through a neighboring property while attention was focused on the main gate. Inside, Uthman sat with the Quran open before him, the very text he had worked so carefully to preserve for the entire Muslim world, now, in his final moments, resting across his lap. He had sent away those who wished to fight for him. He had refused every offer to resign. There was, at this point, almost nothing left standing between him and the men now moving through his own house. His wife, Naila, threw herself between him and the men who broke into the room, trying desperately to shield her husband's body with her own. In the struggle, her own fingers were struck and injured as she fought to protect him, a small human detail that survives across all the major historical accounts, a woman doing the only thing left to do in an impossible moment. It was not enough. Uthman ibn Affan, the merchant who gave away wells, who funded armies out of his own pocket, who married two daughters of a prophet, who preserved a scripture for all of history, was killed there, in his own home, in the year 656, at roughly 82 years of age, having ruled as Caliph for 12 years, longer than any of the 4 rightly guided Caliphs who came before or after him. The account passed down through generations holds that his blood fell upon the very page he had been reciting, a verse that reads in translation, "Allah will suffice you against them, and He is the all-hearing, the all-knowing." Whatever one makes of that detail across the centuries of retelling, the moment itself needs no embellishment. A man who could have called on an empire's worth of soldiers chose, instead, to die rather than let his faith's community turn its weapons on itself. News of his death spread through Medina, then outward across the provinces, like a physical shockwave. For the first time in the history of the young Muslim state, a caliph, a leader chosen by the closest companions of the Prophet himself, had been killed not by a foreign enemy, but by men from within the community he led. Nothing would be quite the same afterward. Companions who had lived through the earliest, hardest years of the faith, men who had buried the Prophet himself only a couple of decades before, now found themselves burying one of his own sons-in-law, killed by people who claimed to share their religion. Uthman's assassination did not bring peace. It shattered it. His death plunged the Muslim world into its first major civil war, a conflict later generations would call the fitna, the great trial, pitting companion against companion in a way the community had never before experienced. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the very man Uthman had once stood against in that Council of Six, now succeeded him as caliph, inheriting a fractured empire and an unresolved murder. Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and a kinsman of the slain caliph, refused to pledge allegiance to Ali until the killers of Uthman were identified and brought to justice, a demand that, in the chaos following the assassination, proved impossible to fully satisfy. Armies that had once marched together against foreign empires now found themselves facing one another at Siffin, along the banks of the Euphrates, in a conflict that would end not in decisive victory, but in arbitration, division, and lasting bitterness. The wounds of that conflict would shape the political and religious landscape of the Muslim world for generations to come, feeding into divisions that echo, in various forms, into the present day. A single act of violence against one gentle elderly man rippled outward into decades of consequence, a sobering reminder of just how fragile unity can be, and how costly its collapse, even for a community bound together by shared faith. And yet, for all the tragedy of his final days, it is not the siege that history remembers first when it speaks of Uthman ibn Affan. It is the well he gave away, still flowing, still remembered by name. The army he funded without being asked twice, equipping a force the young Muslim state could never have fielded on its own. The 2 daughters of a prophet he married and mourned, earning a title, Dun Nurayn, that no other companion in Islamic history has ever shared. The scripture he preserved so carefully that 14 centuries later, it remains essentially unchanged in the hands of well over 1 billion people, recited in the same words, from Jakarta to Los Angeles, from a single standardized text that traces directly back to the committee he assembled in Medina. It is the image of a man who had every reason in his final hours to fight for his own life, who had loyal companions ready to die defending him, who commanded an empire's resources, who could have called on any number of paths to survival, and chose instead to protect the unity of a community he had spent decades building, at the cost of that very life. Not out of weakness. Out of a conviction that the faith mattered more than any single life within it, including his own. It is a kind of courage that rarely gets remembered as courage at all, because it looks on the surface like surrender, and yet nothing about it was passive. It was, in its own quiet way, the last and hardest gift he ever gave. Wealth, in the story of Uthman ibn Affan, was never the point. It was simply the tool he happened to hold, used again and again, not to elevate himself, but to lift up everyone around him. A well for the thirsty. An army for the outmatched. A scripture for the scattered. And in the end, his own blood quietly, for the sake of peace among people who no longer recognized what they were about to destroy. Think back for a moment to that young merchant walking the markets of Mecca, already known for giving things away before he had ever heard the word Islam. Think of the young husband nursing a dying wife while his brothers marched to Badr without him. Think of the old man, decades later, refusing a sword that might have saved his life, because saving it wasn't worth the cost to everyone around him. It is the same man, at every stage. The wealth changed. The titles changed. The empire around him grew almost beyond recognition. But the character underneath it, patient, generous, unwilling to put himself before the people he served, never once wavered. That is why nearly a millennium and a half later, we are still telling his story, not as a fading legend, but as a life still worth sitting with, still worth learning from, still capable of asking something of anyone willing to listen. Thank you for watching.